Back on Golf Today on Monday, the PGA Tour sent out a 4-page memo to players outlining adjustments to eligibility starting next year and confirming that the designated events award substantially more FedExCup points than full field tournaments beginning in 2024. Beginning next year, there will be 16 designated events, including the 4 major championships, the Players' Championship, 3 FedExCup playoff events, and 8 other tournaments that have not yet been announced.
And here are the eligibility changes for 2024. This is how guys make their way onto the PGA Tour. The top 50 in the FedExCup through the playoffs. The top 70 through the playoffs who make the BMW Championship will also have full exempt status on tour. The top 125 through the 2023 fall events. And then there are pathways through the top 10 on the DP World Tour, the top 30 on the Corn Ferry Tour. Q-School's coming back with the top 5 and ties. And then 126 through 150 in the fall events. And here is the eligibility for the designated events. The top 50 from the prior year's FedExCup rankings through the playoffs. The top 10 in the current list not otherwise exempt. That will include the top 10 from the fall series through the West Coast swing. The top 5 available not otherwise exempt FedExCup point earners through the swing of full field events that precede the elevated events. And then current year tournament winners of full FedExCup point events, the top 30 in the official World Golf Ranking, and 4 sponsors exemptions who must be PGA Tour members. So here to put all of this in context for us, Rex Hoggard, Golf Channel senior writer. Rex, what are the big takeaways for you in this? Are there any surprises in what they've laid out?
I think we have a little bit more clarity for what's going on, specifically in the fall. When we talked about, we didn't know exactly what the fall was going to be. Now that we know that players will be able to do what the tour called in this memo, play in. They want to present these opportunities for players to be able to play their way into the designated event. So now you get an idea of the importance of the fall. I've been told by numerous officials that they don't expect the fields to change that much. And now that we know that if you're in the top 50 after the Tour Championship, you can play the fall. You just won't be impacted going into the next year as far as eligibility. But 51 through 70, they can improve their status. So there will be plenty of motivation for these players to play in the fall. Going forward to the regular season, you know, January through the Tour Championship, I think the thing that stood out to me is the Tour really tried to simplify this for the players. As you just pointed out, it's 50, 10, 5, and winners. And I think that's something that the players can at least wrap their mind around.
Any gauge of the sentiment from players on this new structure?
There's been a lot of sentiment. I think the other part of the memo that stood out, and we had talked about this before, was going back to that players meeting the week of the Players Championship at CPC Sawgrass, and we talked about sort of the points distribution for designated events versus non-designated events. And we knew that the designated events were going to get more points, but I think a lot of players really had a problem with how many more points. In this memo, it points out that you'll get 700 points for winning a designated event versus 500 points for winning a non-designated event. Now, if you go back to that meeting, that spread gets even wider when you go down to, say, the top 10. For example, you finish 10th at a designated event, that's going to be worth 175 points. You finish in that exact same position at what they call a full field event, that's 75 points. Now, there's arguments on both sides of this. I've talked to a lot of players who are sort of middle of the road who will say that this is only going to create have and have-nots on the PGA Tour, create 2 different tours. However, when I talk to players who are inside that top 50 and will be playing in these designated events, they pointed out that with this plan, there is no mandatory minimum like we have this year. Players have to play X amount of these designated events. The motivation starting next year will be much, much bigger purses, $20 million as of right now, and dramatically more FedExCup points. Tour officials think that's going to get players to participate when they may not have otherwise.
When you actually win, and against whom you win also matters as well here, Rex, right? I mean, for instance, Matt Wallace at the weekend, that win would not automatically have gotten him into a designated event because it was not a full FedExCup point event. It was an opposite field event. And the timing in the schedule when a guy wins also seems to matter in terms of what he's going to benefit from that.
I'll go back to the opposite field events, and that's a really good point you pointed out. And I was actually talking with a policy board member about this last week at the match play, and they were adamant that there is no way that they feel like that a winner of an opposite field event should be able to earn their way into, just based on that win alone, designated events. Now, in the memo, the Tour points out that the winner of that event would get 300 points, and that would apply to the top 10. Certainly it would apply to the swing, so they would have the play-in access that we talked about. The other part of this now, and I think this is important to point out, that the PGA Tour wants to make sure that you can play your way in, but along with that process, you're going to have to do it consistently. That if you're able to get inside the top 10 to get into these designated events, you'll have to stay there, and you'll have to do it each time in between what they call sort of minimizing the isolation between events. In theory, and this is what the Tour hopes to do with next year's schedule, there would be 3 non-designated events between designated events. That swing would create an opportunity, but you have to continue to play well throughout that swing.
Isn't a lot of this just remains to come out in the wash, Rex, in terms of what's the churn? And is this a self-perpetuating ecosystem where being in that top 50 and playing these events is enough to keep you there? Isn't that really what's going to determine what the player sentiment is about this, if not enough guys are being churned in and out of this system every year?
Twice. You used churn twice. I'm proud of you, Eamon. That one's tough to do in one question. I think that's the key here, and that's kind of become the key phrase in all of this. And players will wait, because the players I talk to who have been for this, they say that I think 35 to 40% is sort of the churn rate, that 30 to 40% of those players inside the top 50 at the end of this season will not be inside the top 50 at the end of next season. Every player I've talked to that I've mentioned that and we've talked about, they agree with it. That seems about fair. It's almost 50%. It seems like that's a good way to sort of look at this. There is some amount of skepticism, however, that will actually be the churn rate, because we'll go back to the points. If you're getting 700 points, if you're getting dramatically more points, regardless of where you finish in these designated events, it's hard to imagine how they would fall outside the top 50. So yes, players will be watching that very, very closely.
Rex, for the last decade, it's been pretty clear you had 25 cards for Korn Ferry Tour grads, 25 from the Korn Ferry Tour finals. Completely different look going into next year. You have the Korn Ferry Tour grads, 10 off the DP World Tour, Q School coming back. How are we going to handle reshuffles, priority rankings, all that minutia that determines how these players are getting starts?
George, you pointed out that it was a 4-page memo, and 2 of those full pages were Q&As addressing exactly those kind of issues. I think you mentioned the reshuffle. That's one that was asked about in this Q&A session, and the response was the PAC and the policy board are going to take a hard look at it. I would imagine there will continue to be a reshuffle. I would imagine that those players who have access to the full field events will need to continue to play well to make sure they have access. So I don't see that changing all that much. But certainly, when you look at the players that can play their way onto the PGA Tour going straight to the DP World Tour having access now, it is dramatically different.
All righty, Rex Hoggard breaking it all down for us here on the desk. Appreciate it, Rex. Eamon, your thoughts on kind of what Rex has gone into detail with this memo that the PGA Tour has released?
So much of it remains to be seen in terms of how it works in practice. Right now we're looking at it in theory, and everything seems great in theory until it comes to practice in matters like this. But I think a big key is pathways and churn. And there are 7 pathways to earn status on the tour now, that even coming in from the DP World Tour. There are 6 ways to earn your way into these designated events. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's not a closed avenue here. It's not as though anyone's got a contract that exempts them from being relegated out of this system. It will be determined by the quality of someone's play. The real key here, and Rex hits on it with this premium points that are offered for the designated events, does that keep in underperforming guys the next year? We won't know that until we get closer to the end of that 2024 season. It's why I would argue that they really need to look at what point players cease getting FedExCup points for a finish in a given week. Because if you're in an 80-man field and you can't finish better than 75th, should you really be getting any points at all? You still, to my mind, have to be measured against the field that you're playing that week. There ought to be some point where you cease to be rewarded for it.
Yeah, I can buy that. There should be some type of drop-off, although Commissioner Jay Monahan saying, well, the cut was that you played well enough to get into that designated event, and that's where the point structure, I think, that would be the strategy behind the potential point structure for next year. What confused me for the last, say, decade plus, if you're the PGA Tour and you want the 70 best players on the PGA Tour, then you should have had a direct pathway from the college or amateur ranks to allow those players to have the cream rise to the top. Now I think we're starting to see that where there are some pathways for players who, like say a Jordan Spieth, a Justin Thomas. And I know Spieth missed Q School back in 2012, so he's not the best example, but I would use, say, a Justin Thomas or some of these other amateurs who immediately went to Korn Ferry, immediately to the PGA Tour. Now there's a route where they can directly get to the PGA Tour, which I think is healthy for the game. I wholeheartedly agree with you from a churn standpoint. You don't want to protect these players that are, say, 50 to 70.
Yeah.
You want there to be some attrition where players who are outside in that 70 to 100 category who are playing well, who are clearly on a trajectory to pass these guys, should have opportunities to get in there.
And let's not forget those 4 sponsors exemptions, also known as the Tiger Avenue. That ensures he can play whenever he wants.